Canada is a successful country, not because of its public policy, but in spite of its public policy. We will get through this period. Ultimately, there will be an election and, people will make a choice.
Welcome to Tank Talks, a podcast that brings you insights and stories from some of the best and brightest minds in technology and investing. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner at Ripple Ventures. Now, let's jump into the tank for this week's episode with John Love of KingSett Capital for a news rundown. Thanks for joining us today, John.
My pleasure.
John, over your amazing career in real estate, I'm sure this isn't the first federal budget that has raised your eyebrows or your heart rate, but today would be great if we can discuss the 2024 Canadian federal budget that was recently released and maybe some of the impacts on the real estate market. And before we turn over to you on some of the impacts, there were a lot of incentives addressed and announced around housing affordability, something I know you're very passionate about, as well as stimulating investment in Canada. For example, they increased the home buyers incentives, 30-year mortgages up from 25. RSP withdrawal limits increased from 35,000 to 60,000 for the home buyers plan, and a bunch of other things around real estate construction financing. Would love to get your thoughts on that, to access more low-cost loans for developers, more property tax reforms and greenhouse initiatives, and also incentives for, renovating properties to be more higher energy efficiency standards, which I know you're also very passionate about as well. So maybe with all of these new incentives that were addressed, everything is still being overshadowed by the capital gains increase. And so maybe it would be best if we can kick things off with, how you're processing all this news and how you and your team at KingSett are thinking about its impact on the real estate industry.
Well, thank you for having me today. And, the budget, is interesting, but is largely incomplete. Because as we go to try and decipher what all the programs mean, the headlines were announced, but there's no text. So the details of the programs, or how you use them, or what you need to qualify, or who's going to administer them, those details are all still TBD. So while we've had a team trying to distill everything, they've come back to me with largely an inconclusive answer because of those details. At a high level, the biggest thing that was a little bit disappointing to me was there is no focus on a prosperity agenda. The fact is that Canada's GDP per capita is declining and has been declining per capita for 5 years. And so there's no lack of clarity. What that means is that as citizens, we are increasingly becoming poorer. In the same period of time, we're borrowing money to make up for the gap. So not only is our income declining, but our debt's expanding. So we earn less and owe more. This is actually a pretty big issue. And it's not just housing, it's for society. And so, I'm disappointed that this wasn't the spearhead of the budget, and it could have been. As we look to the housing initiatives, there were many. It's a blizzard. But there are some things that fight against each other. For example, the accelerated CCAA of apartment buildings is a good thing. On the other hand, the increase in the capital gains tax is a bad thing. And net, the capital gains tax is more destructive on investment than the accelerated CCA is on accelerating investment. When we look at some of the other many programs, they don't really address the issue. Helping people buy a home actually just stokes demand. Really the key is to figure out how do we increase supply. And as you might have seen in the first quarter in Toronto, condominium pre-sales at the lowest level in almost 20 years. This is actually a problem because that means the supply is not coming. And why is that? Well, it's because there's been consistent policy attack, regulatory attack on investors, no foreign investors, restrictions on all sorts of issues, and financialization of real estate, all these things that is discouraging the investors to put up capital to buy condos, which is actually a significant problem. The flip side is they should be encouraged. We have many sites that are ready to go. It's need buyers, and the buyers are being discouraged from buying. And the initiatives in the budget don't change that.
You're absolutely right. The pre-sale challenges we're facing in the condo market, which heavily rely on pre-sales from investors, are under attack by this new budget. I think what you're saying is the overshadowing of the focus on demand side, which I get because that probably helps them earn more votes, while not addressing the supply side, the investment side, the creation of productivity, is so ass backwards to me. What are you recommending? What strategies would you recommend to developers facing these challenges?
Well, to the government, to the extent that they might have an open ear, I think we need a very careful look at our immigration strategy. I think we need to keep to an immigration target, and 1 million people a year can't be that target. We just don't have the ability to absorb that many people. And it's not just housing. We don't have enough hospitals, schools, daycares. We don't have enough social infrastructure to absorb that rapid population growth, and which is putting so many stresses on the system. Secondly, when we welcome new Canadians, we have to, target those that can actually build something. I mean, as you might know, the peak year for housing starts in Canada is actually 1974, 274,000 units. Population was about 22 million people then. We had twice the people, and we have never, since 1974, had that many housing starts. And it's a number of factors. It's the regulatory gridlock, but it's also, we need more trades. We need people that can build, and that's all the trades. It's electricians and plumbers and carpenters and welders, et cetera. And when we are targeting new Canadians, we need to have a broader prism for those that are in the trades. And then once they come here, we have to, through our provinces and elsewhere, implement policies to help them take their skills and apply them so that they don't find themselves being highly skilled in a trade we want, but driving Uber. So, there's a bunch of pieces to that puzzle. So number one is immigration strategy and really looking to control the numbers, be disciplined on the numbers, and target those jobs that we desperately need, which are clearly in the trades. Now, next up, there's other issues on the housing file, which are not federal responsibility, such as a regulatory gridlock. One of the federal programs was to encourage modular homes. Well, that's all interesting, but you have to have a municipality that's willing to allow you to build modular homes there. And while you can probably do it in Moosonee and maybe Prince Albert, trying to do it in the cities where housing shortage is a real crisis is very difficult. So, and that's why this problem doesn't get solved, because it requires all three levels of government who are not necessarily inclined to work together.
Yeah, obviously. And the term financialization of real estate, has been used to negatively kind of view the real estate investment world in recent discussions. Can you elaborate on why this might be so misguided, especially in this current economic climate where, again, focusing on the demand side while not addressing the supply side, like you said, with laborers and trades and all that, is such a misguided view of real estate and the value it brings to the country.
The whole concept of financialization is A, a myth, and B, totally mind-boggling to me. The fact that a business owns an apartment building versus an individual owning an apartment building, to think that makes a difference, I just don't understand it. The implication is that if an individual owns an apartment building, they won't charge much rent. But if a business does, they'll charge more rent. And that, to me, defies gravity. The fact is, in our Canadian banking system, which is one of the pillars of this country, and for sure a pillar of our development community, to get financing to build a condo, you need to have pre-sales. You need to have revenue commitments. The bank will not lend you money to build a condominium on spec. Won't happen. It happens in everywhere else in the world. It doesn't happen here, and thank God. But flip side is, when you're building, you have a pre-sale and you're saying we're going to deliver this building in 5 years, 4 years, whatever it is. You find that a 25-year-old that's looking for an apartment next week doesn't want to sign up for a pre-sale. So you get investors, and investors are not evil. They're investors. they're putting up their own money. We need to encourage that flow of capital, because without it, we cannot get condominiums to start. Hence the Q1 halt of condominium in Toronto. Today, there is a plethora of sites that are ready to go. They need the capital. And you can't get it unless you've got pre-sales. Now, there's other issues. We've often talked about regulation and also, all of the taxation on purpose-built rental. Well, May 1st, City of Toronto is increasing development charges by 21%. Well, you hear all the politicians say they're all in for affordable housing. Don't listen to what they say. Watch what they do. So what happens? May 1st, another 20% increase in development charges. And this isn't an isolated event. It is ongoing. CMHC has been increasing their fees. Development charges increase everywhere. It's just harder and harder to make the math work.
It's impossible. I mean, if you're spending more than you're collecting, there's only one way to do it, which is put your hands out and ask for more from the people who actually are spending and increasing their pie. But, you speak to a lot of investors, John, obviously in the real estate space and around the world. What's the sentiment you're hearing out there in light of the increased capital gains tax and all the regulatory measures that we're seeing as well when it comes to investing in Canada and towards condo or housing projects and so on? Do you think this is going to have a significant impact?
Well, the flow of capital out of the country is capital flows for only one reason, where it thinks it can achieve the highest return. And with declining GDP, with excess and growing regulations, now with increasing taxation, people are saying, maybe I should do what the Canadian pension plans are doing, which is the Canadian pension plans are moving more and more capital outside of the country. Why? They feel they can achieve a higher risk-weighted return. And you're seeing a lot of domestic capital now reflect and say, why am I investing here when I can invest elsewhere and not have the same regulatory and taxation burden? The capital gains tax is, just as a bit of a flashpoint. And the flashpoint for me is the assertion in the government documents that it impacts only 0.1% of the population. So I think, it actually impacts farmers, doctors, people with a cottage, people with a small business, people with a big business, people that have made long-term investments for retirement and will wait till retirement to harvest those gains. That seems to me to be a lot more than 0.1% of the population. So I feel that was so disingenuous, it is regrettable. Because for sure, there's a huge, entrepreneurs looking to start a business, and they're saying, well, if I'm successful, my tax rate's gone up by a third. So why don't I start that business somewhere else? And the last thing we want to do is to lose our best and brightest. So I start off with the comments I said at the beginning. We need a prosperity agenda. If it were me, I might do things like, I'm just throwing this out, accelerating the CCAA on purpose-built apartment buildings. I like that a lot. But you also might say, if you start or invest in a new housing supply, which is something we want to encourage over the next, say, 2 years, you'll be exempt from capital gains tax. Well, now that would create a different paradigm. That would draw capital into the space to get supply going, which is what the objective is. Now, instead, they've announced all these programs are going to subsidize this and subsidize, but there's no details on the program. They've got to be administered. There's got to be people organized to administer them, qualify, and so on and so forth. And by the time this is all done, I don't know, everybody be on to other things. So, a lot of these are sound bites that won't have any impact on the ground.
It's so interesting you bring up the CPP or pension fund example where they're obviously investing more of their money outside looking for better returns, and they're tax exempt. Their hurdles are lower. Think about for, tax paying corporations who have to make investment decisions. Their hurdles higher. And now layering in more capital gains tax is just going to make it obvious choices for them to invest elsewhere as well. With the productivity, and capital environment that we currently have here in Canada, there's no reason why they should continue to want to dump more money into this economy. But let's go to the specific point about property owners. small, medium businesses, people who own second homes and rental properties and cottages, they're the ones who are really going to feel the wrath of this. Do you think the tax number that they think they're going to achieve with that, 0.1%, there's a shortfall of 20 billion. They think they're going to get maybe 7-8 billion from people having to sell assets in the near term, which hopefully will help them in the next federal election. But how off do you think these projections are really going to be when it comes down to actually trickling back to government?
Well, they forecasted $19.4 billion in revenue over, I forget the time period, 3 years or 4 years. Personally, it's a total myth. What happens when taxation is at a level that people feel excessive? People plan around it. There'll be all sorts of other ways to deal with it. It's interesting, the thought process of saying, well, June 25th, this will go in place. So if you've got some gains, you harvest them before June 25th. Well, I don't know, like who's going to do that? I just don't, that just doesn't seem realistic to me. And there are many people that think that either A, this government may have, underestimated the consequences of the decision and reverse it, or B, the next government will reverse it. So just relax. And I think that's what you'll see. So my greater concern is, what creates value in our society is young talent and capital creating new businesses, new ideas, employing people, taxation, et cetera, et cetera. We run a risk of increasing the flow of those people out of this country. And that's the lifeblood of a prosperity agenda is youth and innovation, meeting capital and creating value, because that value all creates taxes. And I'm anxious that we are incentivizing our best and our brightest and our creators to go create somewhere else. And, the Canadian Pension Fund example, and of course, poor Stephen Paul has got caught with the job of trying to convince the pension plans to increase their Canada weighting. I think he's got a tough job because the big global Canadian and their world-class investors, our biggest pension plans, are going to say, well, we've got a global perch, we've got offices around the world, and our capital should go where it gets the highest return. And this isn't it. And that should be a very stiff message.
Yeah. I mean, Mark Carney spoke this week at Canada 2020 saying you cannot tax your way to prosperity. It's never been done. It will never be done. But I want to talk about small, medium businesses because you obviously talk with a lot of business owners. They announced $2.5 billion to SMBs through the new carbon credit rebate, whatever the hell that is. And they provided new guidance to EDC, BDC, and Farm Credit Canada to, quote, mobilize more financing and to take on greater risk to support Canadian businesses. How do you think the new budget's regulations will affect the ability of small and medium businesses to maintain tenancy in their current locations and how this will impact real estate investing?
I wouldn't necessarily draw a direct line, but what I would do is often these programs are super cool sound bites. But as you look at the actual execution of the program, it's things like the new homeowner buyer's credit that was announced 7 years ago. And it was supposed to be, I forget the number, 100 billion. It was something, not 100 billion. It was a large number that was supposed to help people buy a new home. Well, by the time you got through all the rules and regulations, nobody qualified. So after 7 years, they only put out like a third of the money and so disbanded the program. And these programs, at the end of the day, are full of, the enabling legislation, then the administration, restricts their application. So they become, a good soundbite at the time, but doesn't move the needle. You can't say to EDC, take more risk. They've got skilled, sophisticated people. So does BDC. And, they've got a mandate. If you say take more risk, they sort of I don't know what that means. How are you going to measure taking more risk? We're running a business. They're both good organizations and they're staffed with strong people. But those announcements, I don't think make any difference.
No. I mean, John, on the podcast last time you were on, you spoke a lot about obviously getting people back in office and the culture dynamics and everything. Considering the ease of hiring talent from outside the country these days, what effects do you see this having, though, on the development of mixed-use real estate projects? And, how is this going to impact the demand for commercial and even residential spaces within these developments when these changes start to impact the decisions that executives are making at their own businesses?
Canada is a successful country, not because of its public policy, but in spite of its public policy. And so, we will get through this period. ultimately there will be an election, and people will make a choice between basically a government managed economy or a private sector managed economy, and people will vote. But I don't see necessarily an impact, but what it is doing is discouraging business. You talk about return to office. You find most businesses have a constructive, return to office policy, except for the federal government. The federal government's added, from 250,000 people pre-COVID, has added 100,000 new employees. They're all remote. Ottawa is a ghost town. What do you think the productivity looks like? Now, I asked, a senior, very smart person, that is in government, who was talking to a business group I was in, talking about, the need for more productivity in the private sector and so on and so forth. So I asked the person at the end of his presentation, I said, well, how do you measure productivity in government? And he said, well, we don't. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, government doesn't produce anything. And, at the end of the day, that was that soundbite, and you walk away. And he went back to Ottawa, and life went on.
Oh my gosh.
And it is 40% of the economy. And we need accountability from our public servants, from our service providers. We need accountability from everyone. We have accountability as a private business. We have accountability to shareholders, to investors, to others. Government needs the same degree of accountability. The other thing about the budget, not to rant on, but is, adding on another $53 billion of spending over top an already extremely stimulative fiscal stimulus it's putting more gas on the inflation fire. So you've got the federal government stoking inflation and the Bank of Canada trying to tamp inflation. And so the only ways those can meet is to have the private sector really, really suffer because, not to pick on the CBC, I actually quite like the CBC, but, their allocation went from $1.3 billion to $1.5 billion. And then they said, well, actually, we're going to have to lay off some people. So in the budget, it went to $1.4 billion. Well, I don't know, that's a 7% addition. Wouldn't that be nice? So there needs to be some accountability in the public sector to the realities of the world, which is we've elected with public policy not to extract and export our resources. And so it's, we've got as constrained environment as we can. So we have to rely on creating and being productive on without, using our bounty of resources. We're hoarding our resources from the world. And by putting in these regulations, excess taxation, so on and so forth, discourages that. So, we do have a lot of dysfunction at the moment.
Yeah, I just think of that equation. Government does not equal productivity or accountability. That's all I see right now. And that is exactly true of this government and everything they stand for. Before we wrap up, John, what can we, the general public, do to try and persuade, Trudeau and the government on these capital gains changes, or just provide more incentives or release to invest in this country? You've been so vocal about it online, and we appreciate it for everything you say and stand for. What can the general public do?
I'll start with that. Canada's an amazing country. We have so many assets. We've got, a diverse population. We've got social liberalism, which I think is really, really constructive. We have resources. We've got geography. We've got a phenomenal financial system. We have so many things going for us. We just now have to seize the opportunity that is before us. And the most important thing anybody can do is we all, as citizens and as participants in the country and our economy, talk about a prosperity agenda. We have to be talking to our political leaders at every level of government about the need to deal with those things that hamper productivity, whether it's congestion in the city of Toronto, whether it's regulations that excessively over our resource extraction industries, whether it's, taxation policy, whatever it is, housing strategies. How do we encourage investors to invest in new housing? How do we build new supply? We all need to be advocates for how we help our country move forward, because we need to stop the decline in income per capita. We need to increase wealth per capita. We need to go back to our age-old paradigm of building economic sustainability for the country so that we can afford the social programs for the most marginalized. Our healthcare system is a train wreck. There was a great opinion piece in the Globe yesterday about the healthcare system. We need to fix this. We got some big things we got to fix because it will imperil the future. Our federal deficit's gone up by $1 billion in less than 10 years. Well, that's actually not my problem. It's my grandchildren's problem. But my grandchildren, of which there's 5, have now taken on $1 billion of extra debt over the last 10 years that ultimately they have to service, pay back, deal with, cope with, whatever. We cannot continue to have these kind of excesses. We've got to rein the machine in.
Absolutely, John. You've always been a great thought leader for us. And thank you so much for sharing your views on the budget in the tank today.
Great to be here.
Thanks, John. Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tank Talks. We hope you found today's conversation as insightful as we did. If you're enjoying the show, we've got 3 quick things to ask of you. First, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or YouTube. Next, follow us and stay up to date on upcoming episodes and behind-the-scenes content on social media with Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And lastly, share the love. If you found value in today's episode, share with a friend or colleague who'd benefit too. Your support helps us bring in more amazing guests and keeps the Tank Talks engine running. That's it for today. Until next time, keep disrupting and innovating.